Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation, New Jersey Tiered Systems of Supports, a Framework for Successful School Reopening and Recovery and Beyond. So today we are on part 2 of our 3-part series, Identifying Struggling Students.
Thank you, Debbie, and good afternoon, everyone. I know so many of you do not need a deep story behind SPAN Parent Advocacy Network. Nevertheless, I would like to give you a very brief overview of our work. Since 1987, families in New Jersey and beyond have made SPAN their first step for support and resources. And today, SPAN's projects and programs span for parents of children from birth to age 26 and for women of childbearing age have expanded from people to over 20 national, regional, and local programs that are funded by government agencies, foundations, and a variety of fee-for-service contracts. And these programs cover education, including special education, health and mental health, human services, child care, and child welfare. SPAN's mission has always been to empower and support families and inform and involve professionals interested in the healthy development and education of children and youth. And we are so happy to see how many parents and educators are joining us this afternoon for this webinar. Our foremost commitment is to children and families with the greatest need due to disability or special health, mental health needs, poverty, discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, language, immigrant or homeless status, involvement in the child welfare or juvenile justice systems, geographic locations, or other special circumstances. This webinar is presented to you by the START Engaging Students with Disabilities in Schools project, START EPSD for short. And this project is a partnership between SPAN and the Office of Special Education Programs at the Department of Education. We offer information, resources, and assistance to parents, educators, and school districts that support meaningful engagement of families in shared leadership and decision-making to improve special education programs and outcomes for students with disabilities by way of developing and strengthening special education parent advisory or other advocacy groups in school districts and communities. Allow me to introduce the members of the START EPSD team who are here today. All of us, Debbie, Stephanie, Michelle, and I serve as parent group specialists in regions. In addition, Debbie Esposito and I, Tatiana DeGrossa, co-directing the project. Debbie is also our New Jersey Tier System of Supports Coordinator, and you can connect with us and the rest of our team by visiting our webpage, and I will drop the link to the webpage in the questions box in just a few seconds. Next, Debbie will tell us a little bit more about today's webinar. Debbie?
Hi, so thank you. Tatiana, this is the second session in the 3-part series. Part one, supporting all students as school reopens, is available on the START section of the SPAN website as part of the NJTSS resource collection. You can also access the recording on our YouTube channel. The third webinar will be held on November 3rd and will be titled Supporting Students with the Greatest Need. We'll be focusing on Tier 3 supports. So before we get started, we wanted to briefly review the goals for this webinar. Today, we will review the New Jersey Tiered Systems of Support framework. We're going to learn how Tier 2 supports can be utilized to identify and address the needs of diverse learners. And we're going to understand how Tier 2 supports can be implemented across all academic settings. And we'll discuss strategies that families can use to advocate for their children. But before we do that, Tatiana?
Yes, now we want to hear from you next, and for you to get to know each other, who's in the room as well. So if you could please take a quick poll with us, or answer 2 quick poll questions that are displayed on your screen. The first question is, I am attending this webinar as please select one, a parent or caregiver, a teacher, special school administrator, paraprofessional, or other stakeholder? I see responses already coming in. Okay. If you are a Board of Education member or a librarian or member of a community-based organization, you might select the category of other stakeholders. Otherwise, make your choice. And I am closing the poll and sharing the results. Okay, let's see. 15% of the participants on this webinar are parents or caregivers. So we have 23, even split, 23% of teachers and 23% of school administrators, and majority category falls in their other stakeholders that you identified yourself. Okay, we have one more quick poll for you. Okay, second question is, how is your child attending school as of today, as of right now? I know this might change in the future, but as of today, is your child attending school in person? Is your child participating in remote learning, which might include a virtual learning or paper packets sent home, or hybrid, both in-person, a combination of in-person and remote learning? Okay, very active participation. Thank you so much. Just 2 more seconds and I'm closing the poll. Here are the results. Okay. 9% of you on the webinar have their children attend in-person learning. Yes, there are some school districts that are doing full-time in person. The majority still participate in remote learning, 55%, and 36% of your children engaged in hybrid learning. Thank you so much for participating in this poll. Next, Michelle will give us a quick refresher on NJTSS framework. Michelle?
Great, thanks, Tatiana. And that's really interesting to see, to get a view of you guys out there. I really appreciate you guys taking a moment to take the poll. So let's take a minute to review some things about New Jersey tiered systems of support that we learned in the last webinar. So we know that NJTSS is a framework that many schools use to provide interventions, enrichment, and supports to diverse learners. So it focuses on the whole child. Whole child supports academic growth and achievement, but it also provides supports and interventions that addresses many other areas, including behavior, social and emotional needs, and chronic absenteeism. It's a comprehensive system that screens all students and provides interventions that can be intensified if needed. It's a proactive rather than reactive or wait to fail system. So another fact that we know about NJTSS is that there are 3 tiers. The first tier delivers evidence-based core instruction delivered with fidelity or high quality to students. The second tier provides targeted small group interventions in addition to core instruction. And then the third tier is intensive interventions customized to the student's needs. So if you'd like a detailed explanation of NJTSS, you can always refer back to one of our webinars, which is currently available as part of our NJTSS resource collection on the start page on the SPAN website. You can also find these webinars on the SPAN YouTube channel. So check out the link in the question section of the webinar that Tatiana is at now. And we also are going to include a link for the NJTSS one-page brief. All right, so let's take a closer look at Tier 2. So the targeted small group interventions in Tier 2 are represented by the medium blue section in the middle of the inner triangle. Tier 2 includes evidence-based supports and interventions that are provided in small group settings in addition to Tier 1 for students who perform below benchmark expectations on universal screening. So these interventions are typically provided 3 to 5 days a week by an interventionist, such as a reading specialist or another staff member, or by a classroom teacher during intervention periods that are scheduled in addition to core instruction. Interventions are focused on developing skills and increase in intensity, frequency, and duration based upon the data that's taken. The focus for Tier 2 interventions are typically determined by a diagnostic assessment conducted as a follow-up to universal screening. So there's also another link that's going to be posted for your reference on the NJTSS guidelines. All right, so some students with disabilities and students who are English language learners are provided accommodations at all 3 tiers of instruction and support. So any intervention at Tier 2 must consider English language learners, try saying that 3 times fast, English language learners' language proficiency, and should be culturally and linguistically responsive. So this can be accomplished by looking at instruction through a cultural lens, connecting content to the student's background knowledge and culture. So as a parent, you may have books at home celebrating your culture and that you read to your child. But you can also ask your child's teacher about options in the classroom. Reading assignments should reflect the culture and the history of all children. Educational lessons have more meaning when students can see themselves in it. English language learners' progress needs to be monitored both academically and linguistically. Progress towards language proficiency always needs to be considered. And be sure not to wait for English language learners' oral language to develop fully before providing reading interventions. Students with disabilities are provided Tier 1 through these 3 supports and interventions. So if a disability is suspected, a student is referred to special education at any time. However, referral or determination that a student has a disability does not mean that the student must receive instruction in another environment. Remember, special education is a service, not a place. Additional supports from any tier can be provided in the general education classroom.
So what we'd like to do right now is find out if you have any questions about anything that we've talked about so far. And while you're typing, we'd like to remind you that if you really need that foundational information and you'd like to go back and review the information from past webinars, you can access them in the Start section of the SPAN website as part of the NJTSS collection. So let's take a look at Tier 2 and how it can be utilized to identify and address a student who's having struggles with academics and behaviors. Tatiana, are there any questions in the question pane?
I just have one question that I would like to clarify for everyone. Yes, while we're sharing all these wonderful resources and links in the questions box, if you're unable to save them to your computer, don't worry, because every one of you will be receiving a follow-up email after this webinar that will include all of these links and additional resources, including the handouts, if you have trouble downloading the handouts in the follow-up email. So don't worry that you are not missing anything out. You will receive a follow-up email with all this wonderful information right in your email box. And I have one question that just came in from Catherine. She's asking if we have a percentage of New Jersey schools that utilize the New Jersey System of Support framework.
That's a good question, and
we get that a lot.
We get that a lot, and we've actually asked that question a lot. That statistic is not available right now, but and once we get it, we will most likely be sharing that, because that's a question that we've asked ourselves. And one thing to keep in mind too is that New Jersey tiered systems of support is a version of a multi-tiered systems of support. That's New Jersey's iteration of the multi-tiered systems of support. So there are schools that use the specific NJTSS framework, which you can find all the information on the NJDOE website. And there are other schools that call it something else. Like some schools call it RTI. Some schools will just refer to INRS, which is, what's required, in the New Jersey Administrative Code. And they administer multi-tiered levels of support that way. Some people do use the RTI framework, which is basically academic. And then there are schools that identify as using the NJTSS framework, which includes not only the academic piece, but also the behavioral and social emotional piece. So it's kind of hard to say if you're talking about just who's using the specific NJTSS framework as opposed to other multi-tiered systems of support. I know that I hope that answered your question. So are there any other questions, Tatiana?
I'm not seeing any at the moment, but there will be other opportunities in the future, so make sure to type them in and we'll address them to our presenters the next opportunity. Thank you so much.
Sure. Stephanie?
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending. So let's talk a little bit about Tier 2. Districts are screening students, they're analyzing data and assessing students' needs, and then matching the student with the appropriate supports and interventions. In other words, schools need the right assessments and interventions in place. The interventions must be intensive enough to facilitate student learning, and each intervention must be implemented with fidelity. This is not an easy task. So let's look deeper into Tier 2. We'll start with identification. At several points during the school year, students' progress is evaluated. Right now, there already should be assessing going on in your school district, especially given the fact that children have been home in remote learning since March. Students who require Tier 2 intervention are those who did not respond adequately to the high-quality instruction provided in the general education classroom, also known as Tier 1. Those who have made progress sufficient to no longer need supplemental help are exited from Tier 2 services, while new students at risk may receive Tier 2 interventions. The tiers are fluid, which means that students can move in and out depending on progress and data. Districts provide Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 supports and interventions along a continuum based on individual support needs that are always changing, as opposed to labeling students as Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 students. So when we talk about the tiers, we say that it's a student receiving Tier 2 interventions rather than a Tier 2 student. Tier 2 interventions are additional programs and strategies provided to students who require supports in addition to the universal Tier 1 supports. Some examples include, and we broke it down, there's academic, behavior, and social emotional. Academic interventions are those interventions in which students are provided instruction on missing academic skills. So small group instruction would be an example. Class-wide intervention are interventions that are provided to the whole class but are designed to target only a few students' behaviors. So another example of a behavior intervention would be a check-in, check-out. And that's a structured intervention in which students receive feedback on their behavior at designated times throughout the day. So in the morning, they check in with a staff member, and then they receive periodic feedback throughout the day. And at the end of the day, they check out with the staff member from the morning check-in. Lastly is the social skills and social emotional learning interventions. Students are provided instruction in a small group setting on certain social skills or social emotional learning skills. Feedback and progress monitoring. Intervention instruction should include increased feedback to students on their performance. Both immediate affirmative and corrective feedback is necessary to increase the student's academic performance. Students bring home daily progress reports to be reviewed and signed by their parent or guardian and return to school the next day. As the intensity of intervention increases, the frequency of progress monitoring should also increase. This includes collecting data on student outcomes, as well as data related to the use of the intervention with fidelity. The specific skills that are being taught should be routinely monitored, so at least twice a month as an example. Tier 2 interventions often include assessments that are built into the program. So for example, end of the unit mastery test. Progress monitoring data is used to adjust the intervention as appropriate. And lastly, supports should be faded away as students continue making sufficient progress. So let's reflect for a moment. Debbie?
So this is one of those times where we really want your input. So we want to talk a little bit about how is your district assessing or screening all students to determine their learning needs and provide individualized instruction. As Stephanie mentioned earlier, students have been out of school for about 6 months, give or take. And so, you know, as they return to school, their academic levels may have thrived during instruction in the spring, or they may not have. Some students, there are many students who didn't even have access. So our academic levels are going to be varied even at the same grade level. So how is your district assessing students as they return to school? And how have they informed parents of these plans? If you want to take a minute and type your responses in the questions pane. And as you're doing that, I just wanted to mention that the New Jersey Office of Assessments, the New Jersey Department of Education Office of Assessments, has announced that has announced a suite of what they're calling a Start Strong Snapshot assessments, and related resources are now available. So the suite of supports will be available to New Jersey school districts at no cost. These snapshot assessments are intentionally brief, so they're designed to maximize instructional time and quickly provide criteria and data to teachers and other school leaders about students as they return to school, so they can start strong. These assessment tools can provide educators with an early indication of the level of support that students might need for this year. Districts that administer these assessments are encouraged also to share the results with students, families, and other educators. So again, how is your district assessing or screening students? Tatiana, do we have anything in the questions box or responses?
I didn't see any responses, but I wanted to remind everyone that if you would like to share, you can also use the option on your control panel, raise hand, to let us know that you would like to speak, and we will unmute you. So if you would like to do that as an option to type it in, because I know sometimes it's a lot to type, so you have that option as well.
Yeah. Feel free to raise your hand, because we'd like to know. Okay, Tatiana, would you like to unmute?
Yes, I'm trying to unmute. Okay, Mary, you unmuted now. Go ahead.
So we were told over the summer that there'll be no evaluations, reevaluations, or child-sighted team evaluations or anything until the return of school in full time.
So I'm glad you said that, Mary. We're really not talking about those types of reevaluations. These are more academic skills-based reevaluations or evaluations, snapshot assessments, kind of like benchmarks or universal screenings, only these are designed intentionally to be brief and to have a quick turnaround so that school leaders and educators will receive that data quickly.
Can I just jump in for a second too? Also, there will be, as we're going to be talking about in a little bit in the next segment, these assessments can be, we're talking about so many children are still home, virtually in remote learning that that doesn't stop the assessing process and doing the assessments. So, I could also say as an example in my district, IXL. That's what our district is using for diagnostic assessments for math and ELA for our students.
Okay, we have a couple comments and also another raised hand. So one parent, it seems like a parent sharing that these assessments have been done virtually through applications on computer, and she feels as though there haven't been and she feels concerned, especially if the child has no support at home. And Heather has raised hand, so I'm going to unmute Heather if you would like to share some of the insights that you have on your jobs or you work at school. If you work at school. Okay, so now you're unmuted, Heather. You can go ahead and speak, Heather. Okay, we might have a slight issue with audio. Heather, please type your question in so I can share with our audience what you're trying to say. And other people are sharing that they use Institution and iReady as a universal screeners to assess their students. Thank you for that. Some people, iStation, I'm sorry, yes. the type of iStation or iReady. And some of others are sharing that they're using weekly probes and other formative assessments to as diagnostic tools to determine the needs of their students. Great, thank you so much for your participation.
Okay, so we've gotten feedback from you, and we've done a reflection. And so I don't know if you have any other questions in addition to what we've just talked about, but you can continue to put those questions, comments in the questions pane, and we will address them. Tatiana, are there any more questions, or what other input have we received?
Not seeing your questions.
Okay.
So be good. We can go ahead and proceed.
Go ahead. Moving on then. Thank you. Michelle?
Okay, great. And again, really appreciate how things are being done in your districts as far as assessments. And we're going to talk about how Tier 2, providing, Tier 2 in virtual learning and what that can look like. So although providing Tier 2 instruction in remote learning is uncharted territory, elements of in-school Tier 2 NJTSS appear to transfer to virtual learning, even though the tools that teachers use to implement interventions do differ. Now, Tier 2 supports within the NJTSS framework can take place virtually to reach the same goal as in-class interventions. In-class interventions often use small group instruction, like 3 to 5 students, and it still focuses on student engagement. So these goals can include, one, remediating skill deficits, or pre-teaching and reviewing skills for a Tier 1 lesson, or it could be providing multiple opportunities to practice and providing immediate corrective feedback. So traditional Tier 2 supports often use small group instruction to provide increased monitoring and feedback. So such small groups still meet during virtual learning, but students interact through virtual conferences or even online breakout rooms. So these groups continue to interact and receive support through discussion groups, guided design, role play, and games. So Tatiana is going to add a great resource on receiving Tier 2 or Tier 3 supports in remote learning. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Tier 2 when it comes to remote learning, but I want to focus on communication this time. So communication presents a key element of NJTSS support during virtual learning, as students, parents, and teachers all learn new approaches to instruction and lose that in-person connection. So because many people within school communities do not have experience with virtual learning, teachers and districts should consider creating communication plans. So these plans clarify how parents stay informed about their child's education and services. These plans may also describe how teachers stay informed about school processes and maintain collaboration. Additional communications support students, particularly English language learners, who may feel increasingly disconnected from teachers and peers during virtual learning. So communication between teachers and students and receiving prompt corrective feedback remain important during virtual learning. Teachers often use video conferencing to communicate and meet with students, even though the approach includes discussion boards, back channel discussions like a chat room. So this communication may be done where the teacher and the student respond either at different times or when the teacher and the student respond at the same time. Tatiana?
Yes, thank you, Michelle. We've heard several great examples of Tier 2 supports and interventions that schools are implementing. And now we would like to hear from you again and find out which of these or other Tier 2 interventions is your child receiving in virtual learning. And we would also like to know how is your school communicating with you as a parent about your child's progress and learning needs. Please type your questions in the questions box or the control panel, or again, you can choose to raise your hand and be unmuted to share with the audience. See now, but while people type, while we're preparing for this webinar, all of us parents, his children still in school, and we were comparing notes on what some supports or interventions the schools are doing, or different, a variety of innovative practices the schools are doing, the teachers are doing to engage students and keep them engaged in virtual learning. And I was amazed at some of the assignments that my son had to do, and without him even realizing that some of these assignments or work, what he calls it, are in fact tier 2 intervention that he is receiving. And I'm pleased to say that we have such a great and active communication between parents and teachers, as well as a case manager, ongoing communication, just so we all keep on the same page, or stay on the same page in terms of child's progress and learning needs. We have a couple comments that came in. That's great. Thank you. Keep them coming. Diane is sharing that their school is using, they're coming in fast. That's good. I lost my place. So their school is using breakout room for additional support for students. Terrific. Yes, you can, if you're using Zoom platform especially, there is an option for you to do breakout rooms. If you are using other learning management system, it may be called a little bit different, but that's one way of providing small group instruction, virtual learning. Yes. Okay, communication, they're using for communication, they use emails, but not really, they're not really getting any phone calls from at this time. And Arlene is sharing that her son's school district allows time after the virtual school ends to go over with the students any specific needs or receive additional help they need. They're communicating. It's probably it happens usually in during what they call teacher office hours or school office hours after the main part of the virtual school day closes. And they're communicating these options by emailing daily and asking students during the virtual learning time. Terrific. Thank you for sharing. Those are a really great examples of tier 2 supports and interventions that the schools and teachers are using. Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
That's great. And before we move on, I remember when we were all putting this together, Stephanie, you had a great example that, that how your son is doing these supports during his remote learning as far as tier 2.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. Yes, my son has an IEP, and he's actually in a resource room for math and for ELA. But with remote learning being at home, he's actually they're doing breakout rooms in addition. So even though resource room is a small group, it's been nice to have then breaking it down even smaller into a very smaller breakout room with his paraprofessional, a teacher, and then maybe 1 or 2 other students with my son. So so that's been another nice thing that we've seen within remote learning.
Thanks for sharing, Stephanie.
Yeah. So, and I appreciate everyone's input. I think this is really valuable in us really giving, examples of what this is looking like. And, I hope all of you are familiar with the Road Back book or guide. So if not, the link is going to be put in the question area at this time. And, I just want to share with you how the Road Back and tier 2 intersects. So we know that NJTSS offers schools a research-based structure to implement required interventions and referral services, also known as INRS. So a combination of screening, remote or in-person, at the beginning of the school year, of each school year, offers educators and families a way to identify individual students who need extra support. In order to meet those needs, schools may expand the type of academic and social emotional supports and interventions available within the school and the community. So the New Jersey Department of Education convened leaders and educators from districts experienced with implementing MTSS or RTI, as well as New Jersey Tiered Systems of Support project team and state organizations to identify key ideas for districts and school planning teams who are interested in implementing MTSS or assessing the effectiveness of their system in preparation for reopening school buildings. So now this stakeholder group that I just mentioned identified the following 4 components as critical for districts moving forward with NJTSS as a framework to focus on while planning to reopen schools. So those 4 components are universal screening, collaborative problem-solving teams, family engagement, and database decision-making to include progress monitoring. So Stephanie's going to go into more details about these. Stephanie?
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. So let's talk first about universal screening. And I do want to add that as I go through each of these, keep in mind that I'm going to be giving out some tips for parents. We've done a write-up of some of those tips, of some questions parents can now take back to their districts and ask. We will be providing you with a list of those types of questions that you can go back and ask in our resources. So I just wanted to let you know, don't get nervous if you don't remember all the questions.
And also, I'm sorry, Stephanie, before, I just want to know that that's one of the handouts that you can also download right now.
Yes. Oh, perfect. Yes. So it's a handout. So nice. You can follow along. Universal screening. So best practice for universal screening. District determines if screening tools for the fall are adequate and can be administered both in person and remotely. Districts should also ensure that all students have access to a device with internet access and with the necessary software and hardware installed for online screening tools. Now, here are some questions, and I do want to mention that there are 2 important considerations with respect to utilizing screening data to drive instructional decisions as schools reopened earlier this month. The first was the logistics of administering the screening assessments and the validity of screening outcome decisions. A couple of questions that parents can ask. First, how is the district reassessing all students to determine their learning needs and provide individualized instruction? Next, where is the full district reopening plan that was submitted to the state for approval so that I can review the NJTSS section? And as I said, we do have additional questions in our handout. Next is collaborative problem-solving teams. Collaborative problem-solving teams are groups of administrators, general, special education, and bilingual ESL teachers, service providers, interventionists, and other staff with complementary expertise who guide the use of data to inform decisions about instruction and intervention at each support tier. So as a best practice, districts should ensure that these teams are inclusive and representative and that members are trained in online collaboration programs. Couple questions that parents can ask. What professional development will be provided to teachers in online platforms and using tech tools to support remote instruction? Another question, how will the district identify ongoing needs for social services, academic supports, supplemental assistance needs of students and their families, and then provide the supports and resources that are essential for student success? Next is data-based decision-making. This involves the educator's ongoing process of collecting different types of data, including demographic, student achievement tests, in order to guide decisions toward the improvement of the educational process. Effective schools are continually evaluating the difference between goals for student learning, which is based on the curriculum goals, and then actual student performance. They use the data to define needs, set individual student goals, interventions, and evaluate progress. As a best practice, in each school building, districts should implement a coordinated system for planning and delivering intervention and referral services designed to assist students who are experiencing learning, behavior, or health difficulties. And they should be assisting staff who have difficulties in addressing these students' learning, behavior, or health needs. A couple of questions that parents should ask. How will schools make information available to all families, regardless of computer access, languages spoken in the community, or accessible formats, about school reopenings and closures and changes that impact student learning? And how will student, family, and community voices be included in the assessment process to determine the needs and assets related to academics, physical and mental health, social, emotional, technology, and socioeconomic conditions for student success. Family engagement. Districts should seek to actively include families and students in the decision-making process, teams, and meetings regarding intervention and services. As a best practice, there should be ongoing consideration of families' capacity to provide in-home support for students and the provision of supports or accommodations that may be necessary to facilitate family participation. A couple of quick questions. First, is there a plan for two-way communication between families and schools? Are strategies provided to all staff on how and when to effectively communicate with all parents and families? And do parents and families know how and when to reach teachers, to reach staff members, or to reach the principal directly? And lastly, what are the ways that families can give input about how schools communicate with them?
Thank you, Stephanie.
Tatiana? No problem.
Yeah, these are certainly excellent questions parents should be asking of their schools and teachers when advocating for their children's needs. And we wanted to know what questions do you still might have for us today? And maybe you can share what other questions do you think the parents should be asking in addition to those that Stephanie shared.
So my question is, when you're talking about some of these the tiered system in terms of interventions, and you're talking to an INRNS, and you're talking about like small groups with pullouts and the way they're designed for engagement and extra practice and giving immediate feedback. How is this different, and how are they identifying which kids need this tier and which kids need, say, tier 1 or tier 3?
Does anybody? So I can answer, and then somebody else, if you want to jump in.
You start first, Debbie, and then I'll jump in if I need to.
So this, the universal screening comes in. So a couple times a year, usually in the fall, and again, later on in the year, students are given schools do what's called universal screening. That means all students per grade level at a grade level are given the same test, usually a very brief. That's why we call it a screening test that tests skills. Like usually it's in language arts and math. So in language arts and math, skills are being tested at each grade level by giving what's called a universal screener, and different schools, districts use different ones. Based on the data, that's why we call it database decision-making. Based on the data obtained from these universal screeners, that's how teachers are able to identify where a child or where a student may be struggling with a skill. And it doesn't have to be, it can maybe be one skill. That's why, you have different tiered interventions. So maybe Johnny is great with fluency, but he has trouble with decoding words. So he may need a tier 2 intervention to help him to get up to level on his ability to decode words. So he'll receive that tier 2 intervention. And like Stephanie said earlier, these tiers are very fluid. So once he gets up to level, he may be exited from tier 2 interventions. And like, again, Johnny is a child who is receiving a tier 2 intervention. He's not a tier 2 child. So if anybody else wants to jump in, and any of our, I know we have a number of professionals. If any of you would like to jump in, that's fine. Stephanie, did you want to add to that?
No, you hit the nail on the head and pretty much said everything. Just exactly that during the school year, students' progress is evaluated. And, the plan in the road back was that should be happening, especially right now. So it's also important that you go back to your, to your school districts and say, what assessments are happening at the moment? What are you using? And how will that information be communicated to me? I think that's also part of that family engagement piece as well, is finding out how that's being communicated and then saying, okay, so now what are the next steps? Based on the data from the assessments.
And I just wanted to also go back and iterate something that Stephanie said at the beginning, which is why we are encouraging families to advocate and encouraging schools to utilize this NJTSS framework, is because it is a proactive framework. This is not, we're not waiting for a child to stumble and fall and become discouraged and maybe, shut down, which, some students do, when they are struggling. This is a proactive. So we're identifying these challenges so that we can address them, and the child is not discouraged and is able to get back up to speed.
And this is Tatiana, I just wanted to add real briefly too, that as we discussed Tier 2 interventions, we focused on three really larger areas: academic, behavioral, and social emotional learning. So these identification of students eligible for this additional supports through Tier 1 intervention system is not strictly to receive academic supports. Some of the behavioral support, especially now during the virtual learning setting, the behavior challenges may pertain to, say, levels of engagement in virtual, or time they spend on learning, or responses during those class or group discussions, and how they use technology or etiquette, as well as task completion. So even in virtual learning, students may still, based on their the behaviors or engagement in that virtual setting, may be identified teachers as problematic, and they may be referred for Tier 2 supports. In a traditional school sort of setting pre-COVID, some of those behavior the students would be identified for additional behavior supports through Tier 2 framework would be, for example, number of referrals to the principal for different disciplinary actions, maybe some of attendance issues if the student is missing school quite frequently, or if the student is exhibiting other maladaptive or mental health challenges, and would be referred for additional counseling with
right. And another thing is
social worker.
Right. Thanks, Tatiana. And another thing is we want to remind people that this whole COVID-19 has been very traumatic. So there's a lot of trauma-informed care that needs to happen in a lot of cases. So the New Jersey tiered system of support is also equipped to identify those challenges.
Wonderful. And to finish us off, we have a comment from one of the participants. She wanted to stress how important it is to continue notice for parents that they're helping their students and helping providing the tiered supports for their students at home. And she's encouraging, this participant is encouraging all parents to keep good notes and to communicate with their teams at schools. So those assessments are being conducted and can be consistent with what home supports or what they're seeing at home.
That's really concludes all the information that we have today. Again, I'd like to say thank you personally, and have a great day.